Thank you very much for being here. Today with Bautista, we're going to speak a bit about the results that we had in our first year of the experience of reducing yield gaps throughout the country. We have established 8 areas where we challenged producers to try and get to their potential growth without giving up gross margin. But there is history behind this that I would like to talk about, how this happened, modeling the challenge, and we're going to talk about in detail about what each of the producers decided to do to close that gap. To begin with, to be on the same page, I wanted to see what we call the gap. This is the difference between the potential yield and the yield that the producers are achieving. We mean the average yield of every producer. Some might say I'm closer or to my potential or further from my potential. Some have bigger gaps and some have smaller gaps. But when we analyze gaps, we are talking about averages. Because one of the good things about analyzing this is to be able to estimate the productive capability of a specific province, region, or farm, or even a country or a continent. We can have a more realistic estimation of what could be produced on the surface that we are analyzing. Because we said the gap is the difference between the potential and the average yield. What is the potential yield? This is defined on radiation, temperature that a crop will have, and also by the choice of crop and how it works in a different ambience. We will find different definitions of yield. And to simplify, we are using within the potential the best and the optimization of management practices. Not just the genotype, but the best date of sowing, seeding, and different management practices. In our systems in Argentina, most fields are done in secano and without limitation of water. The potential in that, in rain-fed farming, has to do with rainfalls, and also it will be determined by the type of soil through the capability of keeping water in the soil, in that profile. It's not the same to have deep, sandy soil or different types of soil. This will affect the potential. So when we say that, we can have a gap, and the yield that producers can get when they have fertility problems, when the nutrition is not optimal, when we have weeds, diseases, or insects, or deficient management, such as the wrong crop, the wrong spacing, the seeding date, if it is delayed, for example, as could happen in soy and affecting the yield. So this analysis is so useful that it allowed us to open doors in several countries. I was lucky enough to participate in this global program to estimate the global yield gap. We've done it in over 70 countries throughout the world and in over 10 different crops. And this allows us to get an estimation globally, continentally, and nationally, and also to compare between countries that are different with different realities. We have the same analysis framework, so we can compare them in a fair way. And as such, we have found situations where we have countries with a high potential, with bigger gaps, with smaller gaps, and we can compare among the different countries. In order to do that, what we do is we use local researchers in each of the countries, because it would be too ambitious for us to try and determine yield gaps in countries that we don't really know when it comes to databases and trustworthy sources of information. So we collaborate with researchers, and therefore we have data to do with climate. We can generate simulations for potential yields, because sometimes these have to be estimated because we don't have enough trustworthy sources. Whenever you have the access to the places that give the information, we need to have well-calibrated places that will allow us to have the information that is trustworthy. We need only information about the genotypes. Also, we need different information to be able to have daily information to be able to cover all the variabilities that take place in production. When we have these type of crops, we need this information to be able to cover all of the variabilities of rain-fed crops. And if we have the right climate information, and we have conditions that are unforeseen, then we have to see what the variability is. And when we have to see the yield in Argentina, for example, when we have wet years or when we have neutral or dry years, you can have that analysis that can be a bit more enriched. As I was saying, we work with local experts that give us that information, and we also work with the yield, the real yield in different places and that data. And then we compare what the simulation models tell us with regards to potential yield, and we calculate the gap. But we don't do it as a country. In each of the countries, we look for many sites, and we generate the information country-wise, adding the information from the bottom to the top, so the producers may find the reference site that is closer and compare to see if it's relevant to local producers, because the average of a country is great but doesn't serve any purpose. You need to have information that is more local and specific, and within that we have information for various rotations and systems of production. In Argentina, we have it for early and late maize, for sunflower, for soybean as well, and for wheat. And it is also vital to develop this information when it comes to the type of soil. Each of the reference sites, we have simulation tests. For example, in the southeast, we have for different types of soil, or in the core area for soils that are more clay-based. And we generate this map worldwide. In each of the stars, you can see a specific area for analysis. You can see here in maize, you can see the sites where we have this information. These are the potential yield in maize on rain-fed crops. How about soy? We did the analysis a couple of years ago in Argentina, and we found that the potential yields are in those figures. We see maize here, soy, and wheat. In the case of soy, we can see how potential yield are around 6 tons for the first soy in the core area, and if we go to the southeast, we can see 3 or 4 tons as yield, and in the northwest between 3 and 5 tons according to the site. Please remember that there is information generated for a database of about 40 to 30 years. So this is the average of all of those years. Some years the yield is higher and some are lower. That contrasts to the yields of the last 6-7 years, and that's how you can estimate the yield gap. Nowadays, in soy, it is 3 tons per hectare if you consider first and second seeded soy. But when we see the potential yields, we can see that the average in the last 35 years, we use the genetic of the last few years, of the last 35 years. I mean the environmental effect if we would have had the genetics of these last few years. So the potential yield covering all of the climate variability of the last 35 years is about 4 tons, taking into account both generations of soybean. You could analyze the gap and see that there is a gap of 1.7 tons, but that is not realistic to try and close this gap completely. There are things to do with inefficiency in the use of resources that have a decreasing response that makes it less profitable or less environmentally friendly to try and close that gap. And there's also many things to do with logistics. When you put a plot next to the other and you want to close the loop there, you could get closer to that potential. But when you have to handle 200, 300 or 1,000 hectares, you have logistical hurdles that delay the seeding time, the time of application, the access to the plot, etc. So it is not real to think that you can optimize management in all of the fields. There are, of course, logistical delays, so that when you want to analyze the gap, you have to think that generally, on the regional scale, you may aspire to reach 80% of the potential. Those are the values they have in the states at the moment, between 80 and 85% with regards to the yield that they could get if they were to optimize management in all of their fields. So that is the goal, to try and get to 80% of the potential. And in Argentina, we could have 3.7 tons, taking into account soy of both generations. I think first generation soy would be over 4 tons, and the second one would be over 3 tons. Adding these values, it is 3.7 tons countrywide. You could get this, you could compare it with wheat, and you find that the yield is between 50 and 55% of potential, and when it comes to soy, it is a bit over, between 60 and 65% of the potential. And something that I always forget to mention is that to do this analysis in Argentina, we collaborated. At the bottom on the right, we can see the researchers, the Argentine researchers who helped us. I can see Claudia, so I remembered. We have researchers who participated, most from INTA, some from universities, and we also had the collaboration of the CREA and the Stock House in Buenos Aires, sharing information and research. And there's a lot of people who worked on this as a team. We were able to work on this. We will be publishing the scientific paper soon, but all of this information is available on the Atlas of Yield Gaps. You can go into our website and check them for the 4 main crops in Argentina. As I said in the first slide, the gap is very interesting, and it allows us to do estimations nationally of what the levels of production would be if we close the gap at the 80% of potential, if we only had a gap of 20%.
And in the case of our main crops, that is maize, soybean, and wheat, here you can see the evolution since 22 to 2020. Each dot is the average of the 3-year period around that point. And there you can see how maize gained areas between 22 and 2020 from 3 million hectares to 7.5, almost 8 million hectares. In the case of soybean, between 22 and 2020, we had an increase in the area from 12 million to almost 20 million, considering early season and late season soybean. And then in 2015, we had a drawback because maize gained some area. Since 2020, we've had just one up and down, that is last season, because of the leafhopper. Maize lost almost 2 million hectares. Soybean won them, but in the next season that will go back to the levels we see here. And in the case of wheat, we had oscillations 4 and 6 million hectares in the past 20 years, and there we're going to be also next to 6 million hectares this season. Now, what would happen if we took these yields? You see in the Y, you have production. So with the area I mentioned, now we are producing 55 million tons of maize, 18 or 16 in the case of wheat. In some years, the values are above according to the water availability and the area being covered, and some years we are below, but that is the average. With these three crops, we are producing around 125 million tons. Now, with oscillations, of course. Now, what would happen if we took those yields to 80% of the potential? That is, in the case of maize, going from 7.5 million tons, as you see there, the lines. If we were at 11.5 in the case of maize, we could reach 80 million tons. In the case of soybean, we could move from 48.50 to being close to 60 million tons. And in the case of wheat, we might move from 16 or 17 million tons to around 30 million tons. So we would be speaking of a scenario of 50 plus 20, that is 125, to an achievable production that is 80 plus 60 plus 30. That is the number that might be the target for us as a productive sector if we bridge those gaps to 80% of the potential, 80, 60, 30. To total 170 million tons in the area that is now being grown, and with the rotations of species we're having now. If the proportions of the crops changed, of course, those numbers would also vary. Now, the next question is, how do we bridge this gap? The good news is that many of you here know how to do it. The thing is that there are limiting factors in the use of those management practices. So we made a survey among growers. It was answered by around 190 growers and advisors, members of CREA. So we drew this spider web where you can see for each crop the variables that they mentioned the most. I mean, growers as the causes of the gap. In green, you can see maize. The growers, most of them mark nitrogen and phosphorus as limiting factors that generated the yield gap, as well as the density that is chosen and the sowing date. Now, next to the extremes, the vortex of the green lines, you can see a letter that is C. It means that growers said this is not optimized because of cost. That is, if we had a better price ratio, I'm sure we'd have higher doses of fertilizers and we would be able to somehow bridge the gap. Now, when they mention density of all the sowing date, there they refer to things like climate uncertainty. That is, if we knew what the weather will be like, perhaps you would run the risk of a higher density or a different sowing date. This is the perception of growers, but this has to be validated, of course. If we go to soybean, we see that most mentioned phosphorus. Of course, they didn't mention nitrogen, but then you have all the biotic adversities, like factors that generate the gap. In the case of soybean, we can see weeds, diseases, insects, and of course, among the management practices for the crop, we see the sowing date as well. So here we have cost when we speak of disease management and phosphate fertilizers, but also climate, and the L for logistics for the sowing date. So if a grower has a big gap, I don't want to go back to using gap, but they plant the first lot and the last lot in between, in your areas, the date after which the delay in the sowing of the soybean imposes penalties in the yield. Everybody knows that. And that varies, of course, between areas. In warmer regions, that drop is smaller. In cooler areas in the south of Buenos Aires, that it has a higher impact. This is the perception by growers. Now, since growers know why things happen and how to optimize their systems, well, under that framework, the idea came of making a challenge of yield gaps so that growers tested those concepts that they have studied so well from universities and all the information available today that is still generated every day by understanding the causes of a gap. So what they did, I don't know if there's an animation here. No, I lost some images. Here we have, you can see the test in this case for a maize lot. I think this was in Rio Cuarto. There were 3 lots of 1 hectare, and we told growers, they were groups of at least 8 to 12 advisors in each area. And we told them, we are going to do 1 lot with the control treatments. That is what the average grower would do in the area. Of course, it doesn't reflect what the grower himself would do in that lot, but we represented an average grower in the area. And for that, we went to information from the Cereal Stock Exchange, and we told them this is the average management reported for the area. Of course, the growers gave us some feedback. The group of growers gave us feedback, and they told us, I think this is fine, this is not so fine. It was discussed, and we adjusted the management. So we generated the control management for that area. And then we ran this in another lot where we tried to have no limitations other than water. So the crops were fertilized so that we were certain there were no limitations. For that, we used the simulations with a target yield. In the case of soybean, we targeted to 6.5 tons of yield in the core area, perhaps in the southeast and in the northwest a little different, but that was the yield goal. And of course, the prophylactic management of diseases, pests, insects, and absolutely clean of weeds, weed-free. And in the other lot, growers targeted approaching the potential yield in the potential lot as much as they could in a cost-effective manner, that is, maintaining better financial average figures than the average. That was the challenge. And the most valuable thing was not whether they approached it or not. The most valuable part was the discussion around the management practices that would allow them to optimize not just the yield, but also improving the numbers for that lot. So now I'm going to show you, in general, the response they obtained. Here on the left, you can see the yield for maize, for soybean on the right. On the x-axis, you have the yield in the control lot, and on the y, the yield obtained by advisors for the 7 areas that participated in the challenge. The corn yield increased by 16% compared to the control, and this control was very well designed. If we compared it to the yields around the area, generally they were above, at least 1 ton above the average yield around. So it was a competitive control land that we offered. Even then, they managed, in the case of maize, to increase yield by 16%. Basically, now about well, you should have seen this yesterday with Julian for maize if you saw his presentation. But in the case of soybean, it was 6%. That was the increase in yield. It's well known that in the case of maize, the gap was larger and it's much more responsive to the addition of fertilizers. So in the case of soybean, on average, 6% increase. That is from 4 tons, 4,100 kilograms per hectare in the control to 4,400 tons in those lots where the participants acted. In terms of percentages of the maximum yield achieved in the potential lot, here you can see on the y-axis the relative yield to the potential of the maize from 94% upwards. I mean, they were really close to the potential yield in a very cost-effective manner. In the potential lot, what we presented was not necessarily economically feasible. The margin was lower than in the other lots, but here we wanted to see the potential of that environment. And now, what happened to the gross margin? You can see that on the right. In the case of the margin, the gross margin for the control lot in maize, they all improved the margin. In the case of soybean, we had 5 out of the 7 that improved. 1 was very close. They had problems in terms of compared to the control point. there were spillages, so they had this issue, but that is associated with the fact that the lot was very good. So including more technology did not imply more yield. And then in the other one, in the other case, where the yield went down, that was because they targeted an ambitious yield, and then the year was drier than expected. So the gross margin also fell in that case. In the other 12 cases, considering maize and soybean, the gross margin improved, the yield improved. Now Bautista is going to give you the details of all the interactions among growers, grower groups, and the decisions they made when reducing the yield gap in their lots with their advisors. I'm Bautista affiliate, as José mentioned. It's an honor to be here at Aapresid. This is my first time, and now with José Andrade, that's much better. I'm going to tell you about the Pioneer Challenge. I don't know if you are aware, but in April next year, Pioneer is celebrating its 100th anniversary, and among the products we have soybean varieties for all the agroecological regions in Argentina and hybrid maize also. So we thought, let's make a challenge where the teams from different areas compete among them. So we needed rules for the challenge. One was to minimize the yield gap, but in an efficient manner. That is by reducing the gross margin of those lots should be higher than the producing ones. We have 3 lots, as Jose explained: the control lot, the potential lot with Jose Andrade, and the lot managed by the advisors. As in any challenge, we needed an evaluating committee. That committee included Jose, Juan Pablo Monzón, and Tomás Sarlangue. And then in each team there was a representative of this committee, and that was very important because within the teams these were teams from Córdoba, so you had to be on top of them. Among the representatives of the committee, you have Northeast and Northwest with Salvador Prieta, Literal, Octavio Caviglia, the North and Central Core, Fernando Salvagiotti, the Santi West, Diego Rotili, Rio Cuarto, Claudia Vega, and North Córdoba, Esteban Tronfi. These are the areas where the challenge started. In the north with Metán, Salta, then Chaco and Gancedo, North Córdoba, San José de la Ordemida, West Córdoba, Río Cuarto, Litoral, San Justo, Core, Venado Tuerto, the Santi West, Intendente Alvear in La Pampa, and the Southeast, Miramar. We started with 8. Unfortunately, the one in Gancedo in Chaco was sowed, but it didn't rain, and then almost we lost it, and only 7 remained. This is the advisor's lot, and it was complicated because within soybean management, the sowing date, which is the most important thing, could not be modified. It was the same sowing date for 3 lots. Maturity group was also the same variety for the 3 lots. So basically, the management or the maneuvering margin for advisors was more difficult as to fertilizers and fungicides. Here, what we see is a paper by Guido Di Mauro that says that for each area, there's an optimum maturity group. In each area, we see that in Salta, Metán, the maturity group goes from 7.5 to 8. They were defined by 75, then going down to 6, a short 6, short 5 in the north of Córdoba. In the center, they went to 4, and the southeast, a short 4. Among all the variability of Pioneer, these are all a group of 6 upwards, are Conquista, and then most of them are STS except for 42.
The environment and the ambience. Do we know our plots of land? They had to really get to know the fields, and Pioneer offered the tool Pioneer Links, which through electroconductivity. It does a mapping of nutrients. It does penetrometry with compactation and useful water up to 2 meters. So they knew what field they had and where they could find the difference of a response to a particular nutrient. And that was the beginning. When it comes to environment, on the graph on the left, useful water, core and the coast started with good useful water. This is a summary. Of course, all of the detailed information is in our website. And you can see that area by area. But what was complicated was in the west of Buenos Aires. This meant that they did not have a lot of water and they had to change the date of sowing. But the rest, when it comes to available water, it was good for seeding, and they tried to get the maximum potential. When it comes to rainfall, we know that the core area had a lot of rainfall, but not in the critical period for soy, not when it really needed it. And if we go to the right, you see the efficiency in water usage. You see that on the coast and in the core, the black is the producer and in green is the more intensive management given by the people who were helping. These were more efficient when it came to get better yield. There was more intensive use that allowed them to get better yield. But there was no difference between the coast and the core area, although they had rain more. Maybe they had thermal stress, and they could not go up in yield. But the ones that did very well was in the west and Rio Cuarto, because they had a big difference with regards to the yield of the producers. When we talk about the date of seeding, here you can see on the left, on the south of Santa Fe, and what we see from the 1st of October to the 1st of November, you see the seeding or the sowing where we see the potential in yield. And in that particular sector, these three areas sought those thresholds. They wanted the most, to get the most yield. 14th of November in the southwest is also optimum for the soy. In Córdoba, in the north and the coast, we see the date in December, and they moved this because of lack of water. In the coast, 11 December, that was the sowing date because they did not have enough water. And finally, in the right, in the north, they looked for the optimum. They wanted to seed in December 12th when they get the optimum yield, but they had to do it at the beginning of January due to lack of water. But this is where the advisors were actually able to define various management practices. When it comes to nutrition, when it comes to phosphorus, we can see that the black line is what the producer on average used to apply, and in green what the advisors advised. As you can see, most of it went up. For every kilo of phosphorus that the producer applied, the advisors put 1.7, so they almost doubled the amount of phosphorus. In the southeast, there's a difference. They had a field with a lot of phosphorus in the soil, so if the threshold was low, they did not want to be out. They saved on phosphorus, then they used sulfur, and part of it they saved. That was the strategy that the southeast had, and it's different to the other areas. On the right, we see sulfur. The average producer does not apply it. We can see here that in Rio Cuarto, they did apply it on fertilization with sulfur, then the coast, and then the core area, the center. Some applied 5 to 10 kilos. The only one that did not do it was the northwest. Another management practices that they carried out. In Rio Cuarto, they applied fertilizer potassium magnesium, which they add sulfur, magnesium, potassium, and fertilization was a lot with microessentials as Aapresid, phosphorus, zinc, sulfur, and SPS. And then there was aggregates with biologicals. Many fields run by advisors decided within the strategies to put these type of products such as stimuli because they wanted to get a more faster growth. It's set as well, which is applied in R3 and R4 to keep flowers so that the soy doesn't suffer thermal stress. And then there were plots with a sugar mover, which is an application that moves the sugars around and rises the weight. The advisors wanted to use phosphorus and sulfur to up their yield, and they also used biologics to help the soy that was stressed due to thermal variations. Finally, another handling that they had was the protection of the crop. As we said, all of the soy varieties belong to Pioneer. So a way to make market difference with the producer was to say, let us use glyphosate. And for the producer, we'll use fomesafen and benazolin. We will lose kilos, and we know that the percentage for the control are not the same. In this picture in the southeast, on the left, you see soy that has the 222 on it, where we don't have phyto on the soy, and that weed is completely controlled. But on the right, you can see fomesafen and benazolin applied, and we see that the leaves on the top have phyto. You can see the heart-shaped, and you see the weeds that although it is a bit crumbled, it's not 100% controlled, and it ends up regrowing. So that was a different strategy from the advisors to try and mark a difference and get an extra kilo. With regards to with insecticides, control of different types of insects, trips, etc., we used a Fusion brand, which is distributed by Pioneer as well. Those type of controls were also done with those products. Getting to the end, that is the margin within the areas that got the greatest margin with regards to the producer. It was $60 on average more. They applied more fertilizer, they used biologics, and even so the margin was higher. In Pioneer, you can see all of the information at the website and all of the presentations from the different teams and explaining why they did it. And then there is a graph that shows costs. But in general, what we had said about conditions was that the gross margin could not be less than the producer. Unfortunately, the core or the center and the coast are out. West is there. There was the greatest difference. Rio Cuarto, southeast, north, and the northwest. But if we go on yield by kilo, the southeast, they went down on phosphorus. Remember, might be one of the reasons, so they ended up having less yield than the producer. The same as in the center, and Rio Cuarto and the west were the ones that did the best together with the northwest. They were trying to get a reduction of the gap. Rio Cuarto reduced it the most with 96%, north of Córdoba 82%, and Alvear with 79%. That is the podium of the winners in soy. This was a contest for maize and for soy, and the one that one was Rio Cuarto because they were also first for maize. What did we achieve? As a summary, these are pictures of all of the different teams. What we managed to do was to do technical exchange of information among the teams because there were advisors from the area that may not have known each other. They each had their own know-how and their own experience, so that allowed them to learn from each other. And also the different teams worked together. On Wednesday, we all got together, everybody spoke about their own experience, and everybody learned something. It was great. And also to tell you that we're going to have another edition of brechas or gaps with new areas and new teams, new advisors, new judges as well, because Gustavo Ferraris will be judging in the center area. Buenos Aires will have 2, Rojas and Peguajó. Córdoba will have 3 areas, the capital city, La Boyaya and Montebuey. Entre Ríos will have Paraná, Lajitas, Salta, and Quimili in Santiago del Estero. Also, so you know, within this contest, we'll have reproductive events on the field. Perhaps you'll have some. We will be giving you the information, but you can go there to see the fields so we can see it on site, the differences between the different types of treatments. That is all that I had to share.
Si alguien tiene preguntas, me van a llegar a...
I'm probably going to get questions, right? I'm going to get them on my phone. Is that right?
Sí, acá la primera pregunta.
The first question here is that the main gap is between a rented field or your own field. You would see a higher yield in the ones that are owned and not rented. This is something to be considered always. It's always so. What normally happens in your own properties, you have the fertilization system and the rotation system that is much better used than rentals. In some rotation projects that I participated in, we have quantified the differences in the handling of rotation and fertilization in the previous crops with an accumulative effect in the short and mid-term. Also, you have a better history of the management in the last 5 years. For example, if you go into rotations with soy, very often the levels of organic matter fall, and that affects the dynamic of filtration and the use of water. It changes a lot when we change the crops. And if after many years of doing things differently, you decide to do a crop of soy between fields that have a different rotation, you see that where there is a rotation with grasses, for example, soy can explore the soil more and take water from deeper layers to other places where the soil is not so permeable. This favors the capability of the soil to go deep, and it helps to have a better structure of the soil. Anything that improves water availability will improve yield. And if you take your own field as the one that is well managed, and, rather than the rented one, which is more deteriorated, you could see that there is that situation where the rental lots or badly managed lots lower the threshold, and that means that you cannot keep reducing the gap that you already have, because any water limitation in a badly managed plot will be exacerbated even further.
Quedan 19.
We have 19 seconds left. Perhaps we can answer a very quick question. How do we manage the climate uncertainty in the season for decision making? Well, the climate uncertainty is very difficult. You have to work on forecasts, but everything that means measuring before decision making, measuring water table depth, water availability, everything that reduces the uncertainty will favor the reduction of the gap. You don't risk capital if you have an uncertainty. If you're going to measure the yield gap versus in certain environments versus uncertain environments, the gap is lower in those places where you know how you're going to what you're going to have available. The grower is very avid to bridge those gaps. If you have uncertainty, the grower is going to be more defensive, and properly so. But in a marginal environment or without all the resources available you have more certainty anyway, because you start measuring more things, so you can bridge the gap in a cost-effective manner. No question about it. So reducing the uncertainty is the main challenge. So thank you.